This is Peter Helland on the show Israel with Gus Zueihlke, and we're going to try to start the show by showing a clip of Donald Trump on the day of 9/11. He had called into a TV station, or a TV station in New York City called into him because he was considered almost one of the better experts on buildings in New York City, and they asked him, what were you thinking? What do you think happened here? And when you watch the clip, you hear him say, well, it had to be more than just the planes. I believe there had to be bombs going off simultaneously in order for that building to come down. Because he had been at the basement of the building in 1993, 3 days after it had been bombed, and he saw half the pillars knocked out. 2 days later, you'll watch this clip. 2 days later, a German reporter is interviewing him, and he's speaking in German, then he's translating. And he asked Donald Trump, he said, Mr. Trump, we hear that those buildings were built to handle jets like that. How could that building have come down? Because they were built to handle this, a jet crashing into it. And then Donald Trump, 2 days later, says, when people are willing to die as kamikaze pilots, and that plane hits it and then the jet fuel didn't have a chance. When you watch that, you'll be astonished. We're going to talk about the history, what brought us up to 9/11, okay, and how you got involved in that. So let's watch those clips and then we'll jump back in.
We are having some technical difficulties, which is totally understandable when you try to do ad hoc reporting and getting information to you as fast as we possibly can and making sure that it's accurate at the same time. So
Donald Trump is on the line, and we know him as the man behind lots of real estate in Manhattan, and of course, Donald, I understand you were actually a witness to what happened this morning.
Well, I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw this huge explosion. I was with a group of people, and I really couldn't even believe it. And even, I think, worse than that, for years I've looked right directly at the building. I'd see the Empire State Building in the foreground and the World Trade Center in the background, and now I'm looking at absolutely nothing. It's just gone, and it's just hard to believe.
Donald, you're probably the best-known builder, particularly of great buildings in the city. There's a great deal of question about whether or not the damage and the ultimate destruction of the buildings was caused by the airplanes, by architectural defect, or possibly by bombs or aftershocks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it was an architectural defect. The World Trade Center was always known as a very, very strong building. Don't forget, that took a big bomb in the basement. Now, the basement is the most vulnerable place because that's your foundation, and it withstood that. And I got to see that area about 3 or 4 days after it took place because one of my structural engineers actually took me for a tour because he did the building. And I said, I can't believe it. The building was standing solid, and half of the columns were blown out. I mean, so this was an unbelievably powerful building. If you know anything about structure, it was one of the first buildings that was built from the outside. The steel, the reason the World Trade Center had such narrow windows is that in between all the windows, you had the steel on the outside. So you had the steel on the outside of the building. That's why when I first looked, and you had big, heavy I-beams, when I first looked at it, I couldn't believe it because there was a hole in the steel. And this is steel that was, you remember the width of the windows in the World Trade Center, folks. I think, if you were ever up there, they were quite narrow. And in between was this heavy steel. I said, how could a plane, even a 767 or 747, or whatever it might have been, how could it possibly go through the steel? I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall. Most buildings are built with the steel is on the inside around the elevator shaft. This one was built from the outside, which is the strongest structure you can have, and it was almost just like a can of soup.
Donald, we were looking at pictures all morning long of that plane coming into building number 2, and when you see that approach the far side, and then all of a sudden, within a matter of a millisecond, the explosion pops out the other side.
Right. I just think that it was a plane with more than just fuel. I think, obviously, they were very big planes. They were going very rapidly because I was also watching where the plane seemed to be not only going fast, it seemed to be coming down into the building. So it was getting the speed from going downhill, so to speak. It just seemed to me that to do that kind of destruction is even more than a big plane, because you're talking about taking out steel, the heaviest caliber steel that was used on a building. I mean, these buildings were rock solid, and it's just an amazing thing. This country is different today, and it's going to be different than it ever was for many years to come.
Very profound statement and very true.
Nun, liebe Zuschauer, schalten wir nach New York zu unserem Reporter Stefan Bachenheimer. Und er hat einen Gesprächspartner. Sie werden ihn auf den ersten Blick erkennen. Es ist Donald Trump.
Ja, guten Abend nach Berlin. Wir stehen hier ungefähr 4 Blocks vom World Trade Center entfernt, oder das, was davon übrig geblieben ist. Und neben mir steht Donald Trump. Donald Trump hat selber einige Gebäude in der Gegend. Ich werde ihn kurz dazu befragen. Mr. Trump, a lot of people ask, how is it possible that a Boeing plane would be able to destroy or 2 planes would be able to destroy the Twin Towers? Because they were constructed to withstand like a 707 attack.
Well, it's tremendous power and tremendous heat, and people were willing to die, and when they're willing to die and when they're willing to become kamikazes of a sense, there's very little you can do about it. I mean, the heat and the power, actually it was amazing that the initial jolts didn't jar the building as much as people would have thought, but the tremendous amounts of fuel that was dumped on the building and 1600 degrees temperature, I guess that's probably more than anything could take, no matter what.
Ich habe ihn gefragt, wie kann es denn passieren, dass diese Gebäude von einem Flugzeug zerstört werden? Die Twin Towers waren gebaut worden, um auch dem Ansturm einer Boeing zu widerstehen. Er sagt, es ist die unglaubliche Hitze, die sich entwickelt hat, die Aufschlagkraft, das Benzin, was diese Gebäude zu Fall gebracht hat. Man kann gegen solche Dinge nichts tun.
What these 2 clips might do to some people is get angry again at Donald Trump for being a hypocrite, because there's no way he's being honest here as far as a lot of observers. So now we're tempted maybe not to pray for him. So Gus, let's just go to the scripture that grounds us where as a Christian we ought to be. Okay. So Paul writes, and this is the New Jerusalem, in Timothy chapter 2, but the verse before beginning of chapter 2, Paul writes, I mean men like Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan, to teach them not to be blasphemous. My advice is that, first of all, there should be prayers offered for everyone, petitions, intercessions, and thanksgivings, and especially for kings and others in authority, so that we may be able to live religious and reverent lives in peace and quiet. So we know that it's very hard. When President Obama was in, people that hated Obama, a lot of them did, they had a very hard time praying for him. Now people, it's been reversed almost. People that hate Trump, which is almost half the country, it's very hard for the Christians to pray for Trump. Okay? But we have to.
Right. And indeed, it seems to me that that's that kind of prayer that reaches out to those who are different from you. Like Jesus said, pray for your enemies. In fact, today in the reading for the church, in the office of reading, it's Saturday before the baptism of the Lord, there's a whole thing about the 2 kinds of love. The love of the old covenant, which says, love your neighbor, hate your enemy.
Eye for an eye.
Eye for an eye. But Jesus teaches, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, do good to those who treat you badly. Thus, you will be sons and daughters of the living God. And indeed, that's the challenge. And from my standpoint, that's the challenge that sort of got obliterated in Western civilization over the years in the religious wars, for example, fighting between Catholic and Protestant in the 100 Years' War, or the controversy with Henry VIII when he raided the monasteries in England, and then across the pond there you had Luther, who was dissolving the vows of religion.
But let me.
The issue there being each little wore away at Christendom and wore away at people's capacity for contemplation.
Let me.
So
jump-
that and so maybe we can look at this call to pray for those who are in authority, to lift up hands without anger or argument, like St. Paul said, in order to get to a more contemplative stance that will undo violence in the culture.
Let's look at why it's so absolutely difficult for somebody to pray for Trump, or in the years ago for Obama.
Okay.
Because everybody here believes that government is not ordained of God, like the scripture says. We believe that we put Trump in, and they believe he got in illegitimately. They don't see God overseeing any of this. And the Christians don't either. Okay? That was the revolution that created this country. That we, the people, ordained this Constitution, and that we, the people, put Trump in, we put Obama in, and God had nothing to do with it. And if you believe that, it's hard to pray for him because you don't believe he's ordained of God to be there. I'm saying it's very hard for an American to do this.
Okay, and I can see that environment also makes the conditions difficult because the culture is kind of like a ship on high seas. It's rolling all the time. First to the left, then to the right. And everybody's trying to get their sea legs politically, and they're running into each other and fighting.
Well, what's behind impeachment? Is behind impeachment the belief that God ordains government and that that the powers that be are ordained of God? They don't believe that. They believe Trump is illegitimate, and he got in there by trickery, and he's rogue, and God's not behind this at all. So their understanding of government is seriously flawed, wouldn't you say?
Maybe some of them.
I didn't quite catch that. Could you please repeat it?
Would you turn that?
I'm gonna turn that phone off.
That phone off that has the.
Come on.
What is that? What's that name of that person?
Hey Siri. Okay.
Oh,
we'll keep
Siri.
on.
Yeah, Siri should have nothing to do with this. But maybe the point is that sometimes Siri is just Siri. It's not a sign.
Okay, but let's look at the. Trump is saying on opening day of 9/11.
Right.
Basically, he knows for sure those planes couldn't knock it down. It had to be bombs. He says bombs. 2 days later, he gives the official story. So you have the official story of 9/11, and then you have what we believe the true story. It had to be demolitions. It defies all logic everywhere to not believe that. So what does that mean? And let's get to that. But let's discuss 9/11, and then we'll go around and see what does it mean to be operating on a false narrative of 9/11 for the country. But our experience with 9/11.
Yeah.
I approached you about 9/11 first. I said way back, and I said
way back. And this is probably around. I would guess it was around 2004 or 2003.
Well, it didn't take long. That was 2011 is when it happened.
2001.
2001, and then the first video that came out was by that girl. I had the first video before she even distributed them. Okay. Because and the reason was, I almost went down to Waco, right? Because the whole Waco thing started up here with David Koresh. Remember that?
Time out.
What, you didn't have the camera on? Understanding the history of 9/11 is very important because Trump is given the two narratives, the official narrative and the obvious one for those who, know that planes can't, by themselves, with their jet fuel, cannot single-handedly knock down 100,000 tons of steel in 1 hour, okay? So what's the history that we have with 9/11 that ended up where we gave a 2-hour presentation at the Loyola Law School, which we'll talk about, right?
Right.
Okay. But the history of it is, locally, we had people here go down to Waco before it was David Koresh, because David Koresh was connected to Berrien Springs right up here. So there was people here really following that. And I was there a month after the destruction of the Branch Davidians, okay, when Janet Reno burnt down their compound, okay. So what did I discover when I went down there? I had to go to the court because my friend got arrested for bringing in food there 3 days before it. I was hearing all kinds of stuff, but mainly I was hearing Israel connection, international connection, because the Seventh-day Adventists were all over the world. And I got thinking, man, this is conspiratorial here, the truth. There's something really weird going on here at Waco, okay? And then I totally came to believe that we were being lied to. Then we had Timothy McVeigh, and on that clip that we had there with Trump, the German guy, when he's talking, is talking about Oklahoma City and Timothy McVeigh in his presentation to Germany, at least. I don't know if he translated it. So Timothy McVeigh, I discovered in Oklahoma City, was also massive government cover-up, lying. So then, when 9/11 happened, I immediately assumed this is the same thing, and it didn't take long to discover it was one lie after another. And then I came to you and I said, Gus, you're going to have to look at these lies. What they're saying about 9/11, it's similar to Waco, it's similar to Oklahoma City, and it didn't take long for you, what, within a month?
Couple months, yeah.
Couple months, you...
I just clicked around on the internet and learned about the opposition to the official story of 9/11. I was particularly moved by David Chandler, the physicist, because he had an incredible thing about Building 7 that made it very, very clear they were lying about that. And he did it with science, and that impressed me because, as far as I was concerned, the truth is one. That's how I'm oriented in that direction. In other words, that if you have scientific truth, it's not going to contradict historical truth unless you have a miracle. And I don't believe that 9/11 was a day of miracles. And there's a David Ray Griffin, actually, in one of his essays or books, kind of made, was tongue-in-cheek, and said that in order to believe the official story, you had to believe miracles, and in reference to 9/11. I thought that was kind of clever. Now, I don't agree with David Ray Griffin's theology. He's a process theologian.
Right, he doesn't really believe in miracles himself.
Right.
Even in theology.
Yeah, but that doesn't, just because I don't agree with him theologically, doesn't mean that he can't comment on public events that we've been lied to about. So, from a Catholic standpoint, there's two documents that Catholics should really look at when it comes to the issue of being lied to about public events. There's a section in Pacem in Terris, which is Peace on Earth, which is the great peace encyclical of John the 23rd, that talks about the right people have, it's paragraph 90, the right people have to be properly informed about public events. So obviously when I saw David Chandler take apart the official story and his arguments meant something to me, I would go back to that, or the further elucidation of that in the document of Vatican II on Inter Mirifica, okay? So, which is about supplying the media with the truth if the media doesn't do the job of giving you the truth. Therefore, there should be responsible Catholics, both within the secular media, but also in the Catholic media, that would help people see the truth. And public events are the most important thing to know the truth about. Because people will go off in a imprudent way if they don't know the truth about something like 9/11. they may jump the gun and do things that they'll regret later.
But usually if you tell people about 9/11,
Yeah.
we're both from Notre Dame, if you tell a professor the truth about 9/11, and even if he believes the truth about the truth about 9/11, in other words, the official story can't be right, they won't say anything. They're going to fear losing their job, and even amongst a lot of your friends, when you try to tell them, they don't want to go there.
Right. No. So I generally don't discuss 9/11 with my friends because it's so painful for them. They don't want to hear about these things, and
but they need to hear about it because most of your friends work, and their life is kind of given over a large part.
I think
of it.
all my friends work.
Right,
Yeah.
and it's given over to make enough money to keep their household run right.
Right, that's what they...
And yet, if you look at the debt at the time of 9/11, our debt was less than $6 trillion. Now our debt is almost $23 trillion, according to the official accounts.
Right.
And how much of that debt increase from $6 trillion to $23 trillion is the result of all that is involved in following the official narrative of 9/11?
That's a good question.
And it could be, based on how we got to the $6 trillion, it could be that $10 trillion of our debt is because of chasing 9/11. So these people that are concerned about coming up with enough money for their family, isn't it interesting they have no concern about the 10 trillion? And yet it's all about the common good, right? Because most of your friends are Christian. So it's all about the common good. Well, then how about concern for the 10 trillion? Is anybody concerned?
I think, I think a lot of people just think that those things are way outside their realm, and they have to approach their life without...
But they'll have their son join the military and lay his life down for something, but they won't touch this? Then who's going to touch it?
I don't know. But because of you and your insistence and your friendship with me, you made me touch this third rail. And now, as I look over the history of it, I'm kind of glad I did. Because when it's all said and done, and when I'm buried and gone, I'd rather be on the side of truth and in a very uncomfortable situation than to be on the side of having not done anything about the problem of Pachamentaris paragraph 90, which is the right everybody has. This isn't just for Catholics. The right everybody has to be truthfully informed about public events.
Part of who you are, if I could just say it, you have been, since you were 12 years old, till recently, a disciple of George Anastopoulos, so to speak.
Yes.
Okay. And
very much. He's the
Socrates.
He's the Socrates of Chicago, and he asked the linchpin question that empowered me to look at Christianity much more seriously than I did before him.
Right. So
he's the Socrates of Chicago.
You happen to fall under his mentorship.
That's correct.
And he's called the Socrates of Chicago. He died
in February of 2014.
Okay. But the point is that one time I was with you and he invited us to a lecture, University of Chicago.
Right. We were actually going to Chicago to visit a friend of ours who was very, very ill, and we couldn't get into the hospital at that moment. So we went, and George invited me to his class, and I said, okay, I have time. I'll go to your class with Peter, and then we'll go to the hospital afterwards. So that's what happened. But the
initial thing was is that you felt defeated. We were with George, went to a lecture, and then you were down and out. And I said, it's not over though. Don't feel. I said, and I had the brand new book by David Ray Griffin on 9/11, and I said, George, but what about 9/11? and I showed him that book, which is, demolishes the official story, then you tell the story at that point.
Yeah, George, noticing that book, he asked the question, what press wrote this book? I mean, he was very interested in who published it, what is this about? He started questioning me, and then he was horrified to find out that I believed the 9/11 truth movement over the official story. He thought that at this point, I mean, he called us fringe people, and how are things on the fringe, and
I mean, he was getting really intense.
he was getting very intense. And then the next time I met him, he was giving a lecture at Notre Dame. I met him after the lecture, and after the lecture, he brought it up again. And how, now at this point, it was more like he was really disappointed in me. Okay? Like I was, and I said, George,
You're into mortal sin.
well, he couldn't use those kinds of categories,
But
but
intellectually,
he thought that I had really kind of gone off the deep end. Okay, so I'm now to face down a guy as brilliant as George Anastopoulos. Remember, he graduated #1 in his law class, the University of Chicago in 1951, with Ramsey Clark and Robert Bork underneath him. And then he refuses to answer the question, are you a communist, in 1951, which is, of course, the height of what people call the McCarthy era, right?
Yeah.
The Illinois bar refuses him admission. He never becomes a bar lawyer. He becomes a teacher instead. And you pick up the story in 1969. My mother and I are attending his classes up in Door County, and the rest is history. We become friends with George Anastopoulos, despite the major political differences that would exist between a person from Appleton, Wisconsin, and a person...
University of Chicago.
Well, yeah, right. Ultimately, Appleton, Wisconsin, University of Chicago, a little bit different politically, to say the least.
Yeah, because you guys are basically all real strong Christians up there, more or less. And down there, what are they?
They're fairly secular, let's just say. So the thing is that George and the Socrates of Chicago, at this point, he's really wondering what to do, and he asked me for more information. I get some more video. I borrowed some CDs from you, I believe, and sent them to George and had him watch them. And something about those CDs, they were from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Mm-hmm. Something happened, because the next time we went to Chicago, we were invited to come.
Income disparity class?
Yeah, we were going to talk about income disparity.
In his class on evidence.
And that's right. And it was his jurisprudence class.
Oh,
okay. And so we're there to talk about income disparity. And because that's...
We got in there late because we couldn't find a parking place.
Right. And boy, you got good memory. Good. And so there we are in his class, and toward the end of the class, he looks at you and me and he says, well, Gus is a Catholic, and he comes from Appleton, Wisconsin, which is the same city as Joe McCarthy. His father was a friend of Joe McCarthy's, and he believes in 9/11 truth. And this isn't Loyola Law class, and I know where the people in that situation are going to be. I says, George, you just kind of put three things against me here. I said, I'm a pious Catholic. I said, I believe in 9/11 truth, and I come from the same town as Joe McCarthy. Well, what do you want to do about that? And I'm smiling at him and kind of like, why are you setting me up here? And then he said, Gus and his friend are going to come back and do a class on evidence, and they're going to present to you the case for a different view of the official story on 9/11.
Okay,
and
now
you're to evaluate it.
My memory was that he
Okay.
wanted us to talk about 9/11 there.
Right there.
And you got out of it, and then he said, will you be willing
Okay,
to come back? And since you're not willing now, will you be willing to come back and do a whole 2-hour
class
evidence class on 9/11, and in which we did.
In which we did. And so we appear, and we had no idea that this was his last class of his life. This was in late November, I believe, or early December of 2013. And George Anastopoulos is now dying of cancer.
Now, you knew that you didn't know how quick.
I didn't know how bad it was, but he was excited to have us there. And since it was his last law class, and the powers that be at Loyola knew that his biographer was there, his official biographer, and the
dean of
the dean of the law school was there too.
In the class.
In the class. And in we come, and we make this presentation on 9/11 truth.
That wasn't a black fellow from Uganda that helped us set up the...
Yeah, it's yes, a law student from Uganda actually helped us connect the internet to the classroom so we could pull in...
Basically just go on the internet and do YouTubes.
Yeah, we were showing, we showed the clips of the video, the new Pearl Harbor. Was that the name of that video?
I think so.
Yeah, by the Italian guy.
Okay.
Yeah,
that
and there were clips and evidence on both sides, and what he did is he weighed both arguments. So we did that as part of it, and then we had verbal presentations, and George was sitting up there, and he was enjoying this. He said to these law students, he said, "This is going to be a class you'll remember." That's what he said. Now I was kind of out of my element. Let's be blunt. I'm a religion teacher. I'm not a law person, not by any means.
Yeah, but my dad is a lawyer.
Well, no, you have that background. My dad was a banker, and he was a maverick banker. So it just didn't. I mean, I don't even know all the decorum having to do with the law and all that. So it was I was kind of like out of place, but not out of place when it came to the fact that I remember what I said at the beginning of the presentation. I said, the reason I want to make this presentation is to honor the dead, to honor all those people that died, the ones that died on September 11th, 2001.
All the ones that have died fighting the wars, all the
And
Iraqis
then
that died.
I said that. All the Iraqis that died, all the people, the Americans that died, all the traumatized service members that died after that. And I just wanted to remember them and be truthful to them. So it's that classic Greek kind of thing, to honor the dead, okay? And so, I mean, that was my appeal directly to George Anastopoulos.
But at the end of it,
Yeah.
the law students asked me a question, right?
Yeah, they
Because I was doing a lot of the presentation.
Yes, you gave them a lot of the presentation. Yeah.
And they asked me, well, who do you think did it?
Right.
And I happened to have the two books, one by Kevin Ryan, the other 19, and the other one, Christopher Boleyn. What was the title of that one again?
I think it was called Solving 9/11.
Solving 9/11 by Christopher Boleyn. And I lifted up, I said, here are the two books that basically are going to tell you who did it. And I said, I favor Christopher Boleyn's
Right.
take on it.
Take on it, right. I understand.
And
so we went on from there, and we drove back to George's house with George, you and I. I remember taking the outer drive there with George. He called it the outer drive. He was dating himself. We wouldn't call it the outer drive. We'd call it Lakeshore Drive, right?
yeah.
But we took him home, back to the south side of Chicago from Loyola. We had dinner with him and his wife, and we drove back to South Bend that night.
And he died how much later?
He died he died on Valentine's Day of 2014.
So he
it was about
died 2 months later.
3 months later.
3 months later.
Yeah, and I visited him 3 times after that before he died. Prayed with him, talked with him, consoled him, did the things that a Christian minister would do for someone who was dying.
But the pertinent point here is that with Trump going with the official story 2 days later, if you're operating on what George Anastopoulos knew was true, he knew we were telling the truth. He opposed it in the beginning. But what does that mean? Does that mean you have all these people? I can name all the great commentators and thinkers that are making great insights into the Middle East, but they're all operating off the official narrative. So what does that, I mean, if you're operating off the official narrative, how much are you missing?
From my standpoint, you're missing an awful lot. And from my standpoint, we owe, well, as I said to the Loyola Law class, we owe it, especially to those who have died, to be truthful with the truth. And any little part of the truth that we can assemble, we should. And here's where I think that, here's the point about truth that I've been thinking about a lot, is that there's two components. One is the prayer of St. Francis about the truth, where he says, "For all of us would be blind if not for the light of the Lord." In other words, we really need God's wisdom and God's light to kind of help us in the confusion and all the different voices about the truth, even when the voices come from the same person.
Well, think about,
which they often do.
Think about this.
Yeah.
The people that have the higher IQs,
yeah,
so to speak, are the ones that go mostly with the official story. How do you explain that?
I don't.
These professors at all these universities and colleges across the country, by their silence or by their, open approval, they almost all go with the official story, and they have high IQs.
Yeah, they do.
What's so hard about seeing it?
I don't know. All I can do is go back to Franz Jagerstrader, who, when they asked him why did he refuse to put on a Nazi uniform, and his bishop said it was okay to do it, even as a medic, or he could take a certain role where he didn't have to kill anybody, but he should still put on the uniform of the Nazis. He says, "I can't do it." And when they quizzed him, he said, quizzed him is the wrong word. When they interrogated him in the face of that, even church or state, he said, "They don't have the grace to see it. I have the grace to see it." And in some ways, I'm wondering if this isn't sort of a grace to see this truth, rather than something that's due to my IQ. See, I think we make too much of IQ, and that God works through simplicity, like St. Francis taught. But on top of that, the other part of this struggle is to keep the First Amendment alive, which was a huge part of George Anastopoulos' legal career. He's a great defender of the First Amendment.
In other words, it's very hard to bring this 9/11 issue into the culture.
Right, and we got to use the First Amendment freely to do it. And the worst thing that can happen is for people to shut down the First Amendment, to shut down the freedom of expression, the freedom to debate this topic. So I want to welcome any of my friends who see this, because my friends are going to see this, some of mine. Why don't you come on this show with me, and I will debate you on 9/11. You obviously disagree with me, but I'm not looking to win an argument. I'm looking to deepen insight about what we're going to do toward peace, because that's what's at stake here. The truth needs to be at the service of reconciliation and peace.
Okay. Well, let's get back to that. We're going to cut the show right here. And
Thanks.
we're going to get right back to that. This is Peter Helland with Gus Zueihlke on the show Israel. This is Peter Helland back on the show here with Gus Zueihlke on the show Israel. Gus, you had just mentioned the First Amendment. I want to bring us up from 9/11 up till now. And right now, of course, we have Trump and the Pentagon making the decision to kill. So how do you say it? His name? Soleimani. And then you had the Iranians shooting down the plane, okay, et cetera, et cetera. But what I'm interested in on the First Amendment is Mike Lee. They had a briefing to determine, was Soleimani presenting an imminent threat? And so they had a briefing on that, and Mike Lee, Senator of Utah, came out and said, this is the worst briefing I've ever met. I had no freedom to ask a question. We were railroaded. We were told we're not allowed to ask questions. You just accept this. So if it wasn't an imminent threat, basically the idea is that he was not justified to murder him. But they weren't allowed to find out if it was an imminent threat. You just had to believe that it was. So in other words, freedom of speech right there. And Lee couldn't believe it, that he was the only one to say, what's the deal? Are we all just going to go along with this railroading?
Yeah, no, is he from Utah?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm saying with freedom of speech is everywhere. In other words, being afraid to speak out in any situation. When basically, if you don't, obviously the greatest freedom of speech is if you don't warn the wicked, their blood's on you. So if you fail to speak then, their blood's on you. Okay, so that's the ultimate danger of losing free speech. Because if you're afraid to warn the wicked, then their blood is on you, and now your soul is in absolute jeopardy.
Yeah, and of course, the freedom of speech is meant to kind of permeate three major institutions that I can think about. The church is one, and the freedom of speech there is the freedom of inquiry, like Jesus in the temple at 12, asking the doctors of the law all those questions. My sense is that even though he was only 12, and they were amazed at his answers, there was a fair amount of freedom in that interaction.
12-year-old was able to ask the elders?
Yeah.
It's pretty powerful, right?
Right. No, in fact, it's kind of paradigmatic of a kind of freedom that the church offers to the society sometimes. And you think, too, about in communist Poland, even the people who didn't believe in God looked to the Catholic Church to get more freedom in their society. They were happy that the church was offering them a vision of more political freedom. Okay.
Well, the church really got its start because they had people willing to tell the truth in the face of death.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And that created space.
Right.
And the only way we're going to get that space back, because we've lost it in a way, is probably you're going to have people willing to speak the truth at the risk of death.
Well,
Well, maybe here you'll lose your job. If you speak out and tell the truth about 9/11 at Notre Dame, most likely you will lose your job.
I don't think so.
Really?
I think you're being...
How come people are afraid?
You're exaggerating that,
Yeah,
I think. But
No,
maybe
we
you
know,
could be right.
Do you know any professor that has the guts, that has spoken out on 9/11? Is anybody at all? Do you know any professor that spoke out against the sodomy of Mayor Buttigieg? A Catholic university. Not one professor criticized Mayor Buttigieg for being a sodomite, which means they did not warn the wicked that the blood is on them. You would think they would, just to be clear of the blood. No.
Well,
why aren't they?
That's your application, your opinion of. I don't know enough
Then
about
what
Notre
is free
Dame
speech
to
about?
say that.
What is free speech what's the most important use of free speech? Is it not to warn the wicked and preach the gospel?
It's yeah, but there's a political side to it too.
True.
But okay. Bigger picture here.
Okay.
First of all, I do know that there are people at Notre Dame who have spoken about Pete Buttigieg. Okay.
Did they make it public?
I don't know, but I
Yeah.
know they have opinions.
Yeah, but they didn't make it public. And the Christian message is a public profession. Paul preached in the marketplace. The Christian has to be willing.
Yeah, well, but there's that other passage.
Inter Mirifica is ultimately about getting the gospel into the marketplace. That
right.
was one of the first documents of Vatican II, and one of the most important.
But we must be willing to not crush the smoldering wick or quench the.
Okay.
We're not supposed to quench the smoldering wick or crush the bruised reed.
Okay.
Okay. So indeed, God sometimes has other ways of getting the justice through to places like Notre Dame. You jumped at Notre Dame. I was talking not about Notre Dame, but
that's just where we are.
I know, but I was talking about the church in Poland, and you jumped to Notre Dame. And of course, it is the second area I thought where the First Amendment does apply. That is in the academy. So you got the freedom of religion. You should have free inquiry and academic freedom in the academy. And then you should have freedom in the political realm for public debate of political issues. If those freedoms are healthy in a society, what can happen is people can plant seeds of the renewal of the society. If those freedoms are not there, if people are just throwing away books or canceling people who are writing from Amazon or whatever, if they're doing that, or cutting off their YouTube channel, or whatever else, without any real adjudication, destroying the First Amendment that way, then we got a real problem, because the society is dependent upon correcting speech where people make mistakes in the what they say. You correct it with more speech.
Well,
just like I corrected you just now on Notre Dame.
Okay.
You said this thing about heralding at Notre Dame, and I said, well, sometimes you don't want to bruise the crushed.
But the way they control free speech is precisely this. How many people run for office on the local, state, and federal level? Okay, and they have open meetings for all those elections. They have a town hall meeting. They have this. At all those for the last 20 years, how many have discussed 9/11?
I don't know. Probably not many.
1% of 1%, most likely.
Okay.
And the candidates they'll refuse to even answer the question. So if somebody says, well, hold it here, we're $23 trillion in debt, probably $10 trillion of it is because of 9/11. Isn't that pertinent on a local level? Isn't that pertinent on a state level and a federal? And they will never go there. Never. 1% of 1%. That's how they control the free speech.
Wow.
First of all, nobody will ask the question. They've already been subdued. And so we're missing most everything all the time.
Wow.
You listen to anybody on TV, Fox News, anybody. Oh, and they may pontificate on what's going on, but they'll never factor in 9/11. And like you said, if they're not factoring in 9/11, they're pretty much missing.
Well, they're missing a big section of political discussion.
You could argue that they're missing the main thing.
They might be missing the main thing.
So what good are they?
Well, that's where we come in. We have to encourage people to no longer be afraid. Like John Paul II, when he became Pope, what was his first line? Do not be afraid. It's time for people to throw off their fear and sit down, put the guns down, and let's talk.
Well,
that's the problem.
Let's go back to Mark Knoll, one of the greatest Christian historians here at Notre Dame, who said theology today is mostly determined by the canons of Sherman and Grant.
Which is a very...
And those canons represent fear, right? In other words, when somebody points a gun at your head and said, Gus, you will be a Muslim, you go, yes, I will. Okay. In other words, of course, this is not Muslim. The North was not bringing Muslim to the South, but let me tell you what the North was bringing. It was not what the South believed, okay? It was not the Bible Belt in the North, anything but. Okay? And that's what we've been conquered by, and you better fall in line with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address or you won't have any success.
Yeah, well,
same-sex marriage is Gettysburg Address. That's how they argued it in the courts. Okay? So I'm just saying people yield to the fear, not to an argument. They're not yielding to logic. They're yielding to the fear of force and threatening their livelihood, even possibly their death. We don't know. But that's what they're yielding to. They're not yielding to free speech arguments.
Right. Well, we have to bring the free speech arguments back then and stand on the principle, even like Jordan Peterson, who's very popular among certain people in our culture, where he says, you know, freedom of speech is about the right for people to formulate their viewpoints and make mistakes and then get corrected by dialogue.
But a lot of it is just a front. If you read Fletcher, 1776, arguing against the Patriots, saying this should be solved by just appealing to reason and Scripture and our Constitution. Why do we have to resort to war? We can settle this. Did it? No, they rejected them. The slave issue in the Civil War. They had debates. The South was winning them all, okay, on the issue of slavery. And so what did the North do? I'm just saying, when you can't win the argument, what do people resort to?
Well, they sometimes resort to the gun.
Cannons of Sherman and Grant.
Yeah, I got that.
So,
well, that's why we need more of the First Amendment. The First Amendment is a remedy to violence if it's used right. That's the point. I mean, and the basic freedom of the First Amendment is the freedom of political debate, especially the viewpoints of despised minorities, letting those come up. Like, for example, my mother taking me, I was 12 years old, to hear the Black Panthers speak at Lawrence University.
What, in 68 or what?
69.
69.
And apparently the Black Panthers that spoke at Appleton at that time, some of them were killed later on that year, I believe. But in Chicago, in that
Fred Hampton or no?
And those people, I don't remember who they were, but the point was they were part of that group. But the point is that in Appleton, we didn't think about using guns to deal with the Black Panthers. We were into freedom of speech. Now,
it can't be. That's where Joe McCarthy's from. That can't be.
Well, Joe McCarthy was dead 12 years when we had the Black Panthers.
People imagine Joe McCarthy is one of the most evil people. If you listen to how people talk.
I understand that. That's a whole nother issue of history that we don't have time to get into. But the issue here is I'm not talking about Joe McCarthy. I'm talking about freedom of speech in political debate. And in fact, my mentor, George Anastopoulos, suffered under the political viewpoints of Joe McCarthy by not being allowed to cross the bar into the Illinois bar, and he lost his Supreme Court case 5-4, and so he never became a lawyer. So it was a tragedy I met a very wealthy lady in Chicago in the 2000s who said, we all felt so sorry for Sarah, she said.
Because George didn't have any way.
Because George didn't have money compared to everyone else, and he should have had more money because he was the top of the law class. And they had 4 kids, and she just was horrified. She told me that.
Well, thank God he met your dad.
What?
Thank God George met your dad.
Yeah, because he did invest in a certain bank up there, but that's another story. Okay, but the issue is that. Well, and of course, George's question, I mean, we can go into that some other time because that's not the issue here. I mean, we could do a whole show on George Anastopoulos and my father.
Yeah.
And Joe McCarthy. But the point here is that you got to step back, put the guns down, and let's talk. and let's pray and let's contemplate, rather than this kind of jumping the gun all the time.
True, but when they have
Getting buck fever and just shooting when guns don't solve the problem.
But when they have these presidential debates or open
Yeah.
open forum town meetings, they're usually controlled, aren't they?
Well, and that's why we're trying to hang in there and make people think about the renewal of the real meaning of our law.
Well, put it this way. This show is for public access, okay?
Right.
Public access here is located in the public broadcasting station.
Right.
Okay? Do you think on all the public broadcasting stations around the country, which is not public access, okay, do you think they're going to have something on 9/11? Mysteriously, they won't, will they?
I don't know.
That's how explosive exposing the official story of 9/11 is.
Okay. Well,
And that 9/11 is only one thing. There's many other issues that hold this experiment together fraudulently.
at this point, it's a wing and a prayer that's holding this thing together. From my standpoint, I'm really worried about the future, personally. That's why I'm willing to come on this show with you and talk about these controversial topics, because I'm worried about the future for my kids and and when they come along, my grandchildren.
Well, what's the worst case scenario? We only got a couple minutes. What's the worst case scenario, just so we can put it on the table?
Okay,
and look at it.
I'm worried that the collapse of things is going to be so violent that we won't even be able to live. I'm worried about that, and I believe that if things are going to collapse, we can have a foam landing of the airplane and save all the lives, rather than a crash landing of the airplane. That's from my experience from Air Wisconsin. It's like they could do a foam landing if the landing gear didn't come down, and the people would die if that thing hit the runway, but they can foam the runway. Well, what do you foam the runway with? You foam the runway with contemplation, the quest for peace, freedom, the First Amendment, the light of the Lord. Foam the runway here, people, or it's all over. That's my feeling. I think it's about 80% possible that we're going to have a violent end here. And it's only 20% possible that we're going to have a nonviolent end. We got to push those percentages back. And that's part of the reason I'm here. I've done all this work on the peace issue at St. Babel's, and I'm going to do some more.
Okay, let's just throw in when Calhoun, John Calhoun, Henry Clay, and Daniel Webster in 1850, they all agreed that once the churches, the three Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian churches split in half over slavery, they said there's nothing to hold the Union together. What is holding the Union together now? What is it that's holding it together? Is it witchcraft? Is it sorcery? Is it trickery? What is holding it together?
Well, right
Our
now,
common love for one another? No, people are going to hate each other because if you're a Democrat, it's getting to the point they hate Republicans.
Okay.
It's absurd.
I leave this with the thing about prayer here. Last night, I wrote this in May in reference to the situation. Last night at about 2:30 a.m., I woke up wide awake and preoccupied about the possible crisis in the Middle East, especially the possibility of a war in Iran. Since I had a very busy Wednesday schedule and was in need of my sleep, I prayed fervently that in spite of the very anxious feelings I had, I would fall back asleep without undue delay. And other times when I was this anxious, it would take about 2 hours to fall back asleep. Yet as I prayed, I got back to sleep right away. Then I had a very vivid dream. I dreamed I was talking with President Trump. He asked me first where I was from. I answered that I grew up in Appleton, Wisconsin, and now lived in South Bend, Indiana. In the dream, I told him how I watched his campaign rally in South Bend on YouTube. Then he asked me what I thought of him. In this dream, I wanted to continue dialogue with the President of the United States, so instead of speaking to him about all those policy matters I disagreed with him on, I looked at him and said, I really appreciated the fact that you opposed the wars in the Mideast when you were running for president. In the dream, he seemed to be listening intently to me. After saying this to him, I told him I would pray for him, and the dream ended. I know, this was on Facebook, about half my Facebook friends do not like our president at all, and the other half tend to support him wildly. Please, my friends, wherever you stand, I've been raised to respect his office. To me, the meaning of the dream is clear. God wants me and all my friends that pray to pray fervently for him and those around him that we could steer clear of war. Today, I remember the story my father told me about his time as the commanding officer of an LCT in the Pacific in World War II. His ship was loaded with ordnance, and his radio system, which identified him to the other ships in the dark of night, had somehow stopped working. A very large American ship was nearby, trying to raise his IFF signal, that means identification of friend or foe. He had to act fast to reach out to them, or he and his whole crew could be blown to kingdom come, right? By being mistaken as an enemy ship. So he broke voice radio silence, used his radio to talk to the American ship. He got on the radio and said, "My name is Gus Zueihlke. I'm from Appleton, Wisconsin, and my radio IFF is broken. Just so you know who's in this ship nearby you here." And he averted disaster that night. You know, we live in perilous times, and we need to turn to God fervently. At times, we need to be willing to break out of our normal patterns, our normal comforts, and stand for peace. It seems incredible to me that simply naming who we are and where we are from is a pointer to the common humanity we share even with those we think are our enemies. Jesus wants us praying for our enemies so that their common humanity with us does not become eclipsed by the ambitions of those who would tempt us to war. I stand by that today too, in reference to Trump and what's happening in the world. I believe we're only being held together by a thread of grace and prayer, and we've got to increase it.
Okay. Well, Abraham, God said, if I find 10, I won't destroy it. And so the question is, how many people does God see here? And maybe there's a parallel between, Abraham interceded for Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right.
We are a type of Sodom and Gomorrah. And do we have enough Christians that are totally opposed to it, enough that appease God's wrath? Or is everybody going along? It's a good question. Okay, so this is Peter Helland with Gus Zueihlke on the show Israel.